One of my personal favorite video games of all time, and one that I have played extensively throughout my whole life, is Pirate101, released by the game development company Kingsisle in October of 2012, with its 10-year anniversary just around the corner. However, the game's perceived popularity is basically non-existent at this point, due to the lack of attention this game gets, especially in comparison with its other, far more well-known sister game, Wizard101, which Kingsisle pays much more attention to. Even with the acquisition of this company back in January of 2021, with the hopes of reviving and rehabilitating Pirate101, those hopes seem very far off, and it is unlikely that the game will ever receive any new additions ever in the future. But that is besides the point. I was and still am a big fan of the game, and since it is quite obscure, I will explain the basic premise of this game to you. Pirate101 is an MMORPG centering around a new pirate character who goes on various pirate-related quests in one long but united storyline to complete either of the two tasks. Find the mythical lost city of gold, El Dorado, much like its real-life counterpart, and defeat the Armada, much like its real-life counterpart. You travel through various worlds which are meant to be satires of their respective time periods. For example, the main world, known as Skull Island, is obviously based on the golden age of pirates in the 1700s, and another world, known as Cool Ranch, is based on the western frontier during the late 1800s. While this part of the game is certainly enjoyable, as it is amusing to witness what the game parodies from real historical events in pop culture, this is the root of where the problem of the game begins. While going on legendary quests and engaging in epic swashbuckling battles in the form of a cartoon pirate certainly seems like a satisfying type of entertainment and an overall good concept for a game, especially for children, the game is perhaps glorifying a brutal piece of history which we know to have been particularly vile. In other words, the existence of this game perpetuates the myth of what is known as, quote, good pirates, or, in a more broader sense, you could refer to as, quote, good conquerors, or even, quote, good imperialists. In some instances, the game outright encourages the pillaging and conquering of more vulnerable groups as you go on these epic pirate quests, which parallel their real oppression throughout world history. The act of conquering in this game is intertwined throughout the plot, which we will go over later. So am I saying that this game, meant for children about a pirate who fights bad guys in order to reach El Dorado, is actively glorifying colonialism? Not necessarily, but the game portrays the actions of this pirate, which reflect the real-life actions of real-life pirates, as heroic and even just. So, in a way, the game is saying that what pirates usually do, such as violent lootings and ransackings, is okay, so long as the pirate is gallant and noble, and there are many examples of the pirate doing this to several endangered groups, both in the game and in real life. This is how Pirate101 supports and even encourages neocolonialism. But first, we have to explicitly define what that is, because it may just sound like a buzzword to you, so let's see what it really means. Neocolonialism is defined by the presence of so-called new colonialism, as the prefix neo in Greek is the word new. To identify neocolonialism, we have to understand colonialism of the past, and what precise components make up our understanding of this new version of colonialism. The definition of colonialism goes something like this: the policy of subjugating another group of people for an economic, political, or social gain, and the utilization of exploitative tactics in order to make those gains. It doesn't necessarily have to be a different country, which is the most popular example when people refer back to colonialism. It just has to be a defined group of people who are suffering under the conditions of the colonizers. But how do we know what is and isn't colonization? The scramble for Africa in the late 1800s is most certainly colonization. But how about the Iraq War in 2003, or maybe the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990, which led to the Gulf War? Are those last two examples colonization or not? The answer lies within our original definition of colonization, and can be summarized by just one word: exploitation. While events like the Iraq or Afghan War may not be textbook definitions of colonialism, which became prevalent during the age of imperialism at the end of the 19th century, they are most certainly exploitative of the countries and even the people that were invaded and conquered. As we all know, the US government's main role in Iraq was to extract oil, and they had a similar goal in Afghanistan, except it was for the opium poppy to make Big Pharma even richer, which is why every American is addicted to this stuff now. These actions of extracting a natural resource from these countries can certainly be called exploitation, as citizens of both nations had to put in their hard work and effort in order to fund whatever the US government wanted them to do, which is why they invaded those countries in the first place. And much like the Middle Eastern wars created by the US in the 2000s, the scramble for Africa, and with even earlier examples, such as the colonization of the New World after Columbus's voyage, were also very exploitative. And in these two instances, especially with the latter, slavery was utilized, and that is often considered to be the ultimate form of exploitation, certainly solidifying those two events as episodes of pure colonization. And if we take a look back at the legacy of pirates and other nautical-based conquerors of the 1700s, they certainly fall within this category, and exemplify the traits of exploitation we've been describing and attributing to other colonizers from before. So, it would be accurate to call a pirate a colonizer, as their main goal was to terrorize, exploit, and conquer any person they encountered. But, how does this relate back to a game meant for children? Well, there are many depictions of a heroic pirate in the game, as you attempt to conquer and colonize your way to El Dorado, and collect the pieces of the map required to get there. Even the idea of the pirates settling the lost island of El Dorado, which in real life was a way for conquerors of the 1500s to justify their brutal attacks on the indigenous tribes of the Americas, is a subtle support for neocolonialism. So, actions of colonization in the game clearly parallel the real-life counterparts, but there are some more poignant examples of this from the game outright. Before we talk about the game and its glorification and even encouragement of parts of neocolonialism, we have to talk about its more popular, envied sister game, which Pirate101 never seems to have a fair advantage against. Of course, we have to talk about Wizard101. Wizard101 was the first major release for Kingsisle, coming out in September of 2008, just over 4 years before Pirate101 did. Its central premise follows a mute wizard who travels around different worlds in the spiral in order to stop the evil sorcerer named Malistaire, but after you complete the quest, the story quickly accelerates away from that and explores more of the backstory to the spiral and the other wizards of it who want to destroy it. Yes, the premise for both games are very alike, except swap wizards for pirates even though they still have a lot of differences between them. Just to show you how much more developed Wizard101 is than Pirate101, and how much more effort and time gets put into this game, in Pirate101 you can only go as high as level 70, while in Wizard101 the maximum level is around 150, and even then, the higher the level you are, the more work it takes to reach the next level. But how does Wizard101's existence perpetuate Pirate101's neocolonialism problem? Well, if we examine Wizard101's premise, we can see how egalitarian it is. Let's just take a look at the flagship world in the Wizard101 universe, which is Wizard City. Unlike most worlds based in the spiral in both games, it is not directly based on a specific time period nor geographic location, like the aforementioned Skull Island and Cool Ranch, meaning all and any actions performed by this wizard cannot be considered colonization. And, obviously wizards, unlike pirates, were not real, and have only had their existence perpetuated by myths and folklore, while the actions of real-life pirates are well documented, and, in the game, there are some things you do which replicate these real and brutal actions, which we will explore in a bit. So, Kingsisle, by going in the opposite direction of Wizard101, created a story which encouraged colonization of groups of people and depicted the good colonizers and even the white savior trope we all know. It is unclear as to why they did this, and maybe this was all inadvertent, and they created Pirate101 just to have an exhilarating experience that was not yet explored by Wizard101. But it's clear that Wizard101 is not pushing some sort of agenda or even endorsing neocolonialism like the other game is. And if you're wondering about some examples of this so-called neocolonialism I've been describing, well, there's a lot to go over. Just as a disclaimer, most of what I'm referencing won't make any sense if you haven't played the game, and while I don't recommend you do, just note that some of these names will not be familiar to you, and that is okay. There are two instances where you must defeat a native tribe in order to advance the quest in some way. The first time this happens is when you need to bring down a rebellion staged by the Water Moles, which are the in-game equivalent to the Polynesians, never mind that their home world of Skull Island is supposed to take place in the Caribbean, but whatever. Once you do this to them, they immediately give in and they see the error of their ways, and comply with your authority, so you can advance your quest. The next time something like this happens is nearly identical to the previous occurrence, where, in order to advance the quest, you must defeat bison tribes, the in-game equivalent to the Native Americans, and they comply much in the same way as the Water Moles from before. The pirate conquers, subjugates, and essentially wins against the native tribes, and it is portrayed as a good thing that these natives complied to the pirate, and that we must defeat these natives in order to get ahead. Now of course, this is not extremely reprehensible, considering that this is a fictional video game after all, but do you remember what the overall goal of the game was? Entertain children and make interesting enough stories to keep them engaged. If a quote, interesting story includes robbing native people of their land, culture, and heritage, and forcibly making them subordinate in order to continue conquering until you reach a mythical island, then that seems pretty messed up. And might I add, none of this was ever really present in Wizard101. They heavily played into the fantastical elements of the game, which involved wizards and magic, not reflections of real history, unlike Pirate101. If you want me to provide you with more examples of Pirate101 and their subtle endorsement of colonialism, I can list off some things this pirate has to do which certainly encourage the children playing to perform acts which relate to neocolonialism. We begin wars in order to create distractions and make a profit, something which very much exists in the real world, steal and extract natural resources from islands populated by natives, defeat them for no clear reason in order to advance the plot, invade native territory, not to liberate them, but to defeat other enemies, also something which very much existed in the real world, and so much more. Basically, this game is one giant reenactment of a brutal pirate conquest of the 1700s and the European Age of Exploration, except it's being marketed towards children. But why did Kingsisle create this game, and why are they promoting colonialism in the first place? Well, we'll talk about that in... So, you may be asking yourself that this entire time, is Kingsisle trying to push an agenda? Well, since Kingsisle has never made their political views public, and since we don't know for sure if there's a collective political ideology that the game is trying to enforce with its games, the answer is that we don't know. However, they don't need to be pushing any sort of ideology to seem like they're encouraging colonialist behavior, they just have to glorify and normalize it, which is certainly happening with Pirate101. Many historians are guilty of doing this as well, and frequently glorify the past in order to indoctrinate the more gullible into believing their augmented versions of history, either for political or cultural gain. Many Italian Americans are guilty of doing this when they paint over all of the brutal things Columbus did, and to be honest, all Americans do this when they say anything good about any American president, considering that they're all basically war criminals. And it seems like Kingsisle, and by extension, Pirate101 is doing this in order to glorify pirate history for children. Of course, pirates are very well liked amongst children, but so are other fictional and idealized versions of real historical professions, such as ninjas, cowboys, who are equally problematic in their own way, samurai, certain characters from Greek mythology, and yes, even wizards and sorcerers, though they are entirely fictional, so whatever story Wizard101 is telling with their cast of wizards using their spells is not going to be an issue, since they are not real and do not reflect the actions of any real-life wizard, because they don't exist. Any story Pirate101 attempts to tell with its cast of pirate characters doing typical pirate things will involve some brutal actions, such as the ransackings, invasions, and conquests we have been talking about before, as they will come off as if they are endorsing and at the very least glorifying it. If you keep depicting the actions of this pirate as heroic, then children will emulate that, much like with other idealized historical professions named from before, like ninjas or cowboys. So, even if this is just a lighthearted game for children, it teaches them a certain narrative about pirates that should not be taught, or a certain narrative about any brutal historical figure, such as George Washington or Christopher Columbus, and even Barack Obama. While Kingsisle may not be pushing an agenda in the first place, in all honesty, they don't need to be. They're just portraying the reprehensible actions of these pirates as heroic, much like what the Italian-American community does to Christopher Columbus, or what even the Democrats say about Barack Obama. Am I analyzing this game, meant for children, too subjectively? I mean, how many of those children will be inspired by actions from this game to, I don't know, enslave an entire continent? Likely very few. The game is still pushing a false narrative about pirates that should never be taught due to its immense number of inaccuracies. We know the effects that these stories have on the minds and attitudes of young people, and how truly profound it can get. And if you think that the younger generations cannot be persuaded on colonialism, believing it to be an archaic ideology, just look at America's 43rd president. I'm sure George W. Bush was playing with his toy soldiers as a kid, and later thought to himself that that was the event which interested him in the idea to enslave two entire nations and steal their oil and opium from them and generally make their whole environment worse for no clear reason. Colonialism, and now, with neocolonialism, ebbs and flows like many other ideologies. Just look at the rise in doctrinaire fascism in America's two-party system, being present in both the Republicans and Democrats. This game could persuade many young children into thinking that bombarding and invading native tribes in order to reach some fantastical goal akin to arriving at the fictional lost city of El Dorado is a good thing that they may want to do when they get older. Also, by having the in-game side characters never acknowledge or even question any of the bad actions of this pirate, it seems as though Kingsisle may not just be pushing a neo-colonialist agenda, but also an anti-authority one in general, which could prove controversial in some other ways too. Even though this game does provide a good storyline with impressive game dynamics, it is simply here to fool us into believing the same tired tropes of good pirates or good conquerors that have been pushed by Western media for centuries. If we can simply ignore this game and hopefully look past its positive characterization of colonizers meant for children, then this narrative can perhaps be put to rest forever. Which should be pretty easy given that this game is already dead, but whatever.